and we are going to move on to our next presentation. I'm going to just pin our speakers so I can make sure that everybody can see them. Perfect. There we go. So our next topic today is labor exploitation and trafficking in Italy, how agencies are working together. So today we are joined by Dr. Franca Zadra, who is a senior research scholar in GAHTS and a researcher at Verona University, focusing on documenting responses to marginalization and exploitation, particularly in anti-trafficking programs for identification, protection, and assistance to exploited persons. And along with Dr. Zadra, we have Venera Protopapa, who is the Associate Professor of Labor Law at Verona University, focusing on migrant workers' rights, access to justice, and the role of civil society in combating labor exploitation. So thank you both for being here, and I will hand it over to you to start the presentation. Oh, Franca, you are muted, but the share screen looks good on my end. Can I hear you now? It looks like you are still muted. Are you able to see, toggle up to those?
Okay, now.
There we go. Awesome.
I didn't see the mic button, sorry. Thank you. I was thanking you, Anna, for this introduction and for this opportunity to share the research that we are doing. And thanking Venera Protopapa to being here with me. And sorry, phones just rang. So, yes, we have been doing research together on this issue, and we will start at the beginning, which is the Palermo Protocol, where all of us just start with all of these forms. So you all know the definition of trafficking in persons for the you know that the Palermo Protocol also includes forced labor or services, slavery, or practices similar to slavery, servitude, and so forth. The question, you all know that it starts, it has these three elements: actions, means, and purpose. But for the issue of labor exploitation, it's important to put our attention to the fact that in the last 25 years, the transportation and transfer element in the definition has been progressively losing prevalence, particularly inside of digitalization processes that have transformed our life worlds, including work, either exploited or not. And that is why the actions in labor exploitation may be focused on the recruitment part, or also even just the receipt and utilization of persons. The means of coercion also have been enlarged in time, and particularly there are many different forms in which this coercive control happens in labor exploitation that are more subtle than the violence. There is a lot of violence as well. We have seen cases, we have studied together cases where punitive violence has been utilized to submit to elicit submission of workers. But also we are seeing growing the recognition of poverty and other forms of vulnerability, the absence, for example, of valid residence permits in immigrant populations, and the exploitation of that, the threat of deportation, the threat of reporting to the authorities persons without a legal permit to reside in the country and work in the country as used to blackmail people into staying in work. So a person can, of course, forfeit freely a part of their labor rights for the benefit of their organizations, but the element of coercion is the key part is labor agency. Can you change jobs? Can you have alternative conditions? Can you negotiate your conditions? The purpose of exploitation, it says the forced labors. The question we have posed is when in this continuum of precarity, when can we establish and determine with clarity when it constitutes criminal behavior? Because precarious work and compression of labor rights is something that sadly is so wide that when does it rise to this crime? We are going to talk about that. The difficulties in clarifying this are not small because conditions of exploitation have not been defined unilaterally or universally, let's say, in international law. The European Union Fundamental Rights Agency has defined this severe labor exploitation as all forms of exploitation that are criminal under the legislation of the member state in which the exploitation occurs. That means that they are delegating to single member states to define what constitutes exploitation of labor in their country. For instance, the distinction between what is illegal compression of labor rights, for example, undeclared work, and what are criminal violations of labor law that are, for example, putting people's lives and health in danger when they work, or suppressing all of their resting times until they are, or also these forms of coercion that we spoke about. These are these criminal violations of labor law. They are not universal. They are not. The Fundamental Rights Agency has tried to put clarity into this continuum of precarity. Sociological literature speaks of unfree labor. As it happens in prostitution as well, there is not always a clear cut between free and forced prostitution. In that same sense, there is not just a clear cut between completely free and completely forced labor. There is a very large gray area in the middle. So tracing lines is particularly difficult, and the sociological literature, that's why they speak of unfree labor. And we call it, this gray area, a continuum of precarity. But this graphic of the Fundamental Rights Agency tries to clarify all of this, trying to establish some lines. You have this triangle that you see. If those who want to deepen the issue, the legal issues, can have the QR code for a very interesting recent report, a study on exactly this, the concept of trafficking in human beings for the purpose of labor exploitation in regards to a more wider spectrum of labor exploitation situations. But this graphic we find that is very clear in the sense that we have the most dark forms in the tip of the cone, and then we have slavery, servitude, forced or compulsory labor, other severe forms of labor exploitation, and other forms of labor exploitation. It depends on which are the norms, the types of norms that these forms of exploitation are defying. So Venera is going to take it from here, explaining maybe also the Italian legislation, which has significantly evolved in the last 10 years. Do you want to say something more about this graphic, or do I scroll to the next?
Thank you so much, Franca. I will take it from here. Can you move the slides for me? Okay, so I'm very happy to continue our presentation with some illustration of how the Italian legislation has approached the issue. Franca provided a general framework on what trafficking for purposes of labor, of forced labor means, and what forced labor means in the ILO convention that is dedicated to forced labor, basically defining forced labor as work that is extracted from any person under the menace of penalty, and for which the person is not considered as offering themselves voluntarily. Moving to the Italian legislation and how the Italian legislation approaches the issue of labor exploitation, I will start by saying that from 2016 we have a self-standing criminal provision that refers to labor exploitation and to caporalato. That is an Italian word that is specifically used in the Italian context, and it makes it includes and makes reference to the gang master system. So the current framework, it was adopted in 2016. It was adopted following the death of Paola Clemente. She was 49. She was working in the fields in southern Italy for €2 per hour, and she died of exhaustion. As you can see from the slides, the definition of what labor exploitation meant under the 2016 law is much more wider compared to the definition of forced labor. So this is one element in which the Italian legislation appears to have done a step forward in enlarging the hypotheses that are relevant under the law for this purpose. First of all, it refers to anyone that, so including intermediaries and including employers. Of course, this includes also informal employers. So it refers to recruitment of workers and the purpose of assigning them to work that is considered as exploitative work. And at the same time, it refers to everyone, to any employer that hires worker or uses their work, applying and offering them exploitative working conditions. So both are covered. One important innovation that was adopted from the law, it was the extension of the anti-trafficking programs to victims of severe labor exploitation. Also, it's important to mention, to highlight how this is different also compared to the definition of forced labor under the ILO Convention, that the law refers, in fact, to taking advantage of the state of need and therefore goes beyond coercion. It is intended under the case law as a serious difficulty that can be even temporary, and that implies a restriction of the victim's will, inducing them to accept disadvantageous working conditions. This is further specified in national guidelines for the identification of victims of labor exploitation, which state that a person is considered a victim of labor exploitation where their condition of vulnerability is so severe as to seriously compromise so not totally compromise their freedom of choice, compelling them to accept unfair working condition as a result of intermediaries or employers taking advantage of their state of need. The same provision includes a number of indicators. They are considered as indicators of labor exploitation, and in particular refer to salaries. The law specifies that there is labor exploitation. It is an indicator of labor exploitation where the salaries paid to the worker are repeatedly paid in substandard form or are considered disproportionate to the quantity and the quality of work, which are the standards that is set under the European Constitution, the Italian Constitution, for the salary to be respectful of the constitutional norms. It refers also specifically to working time, and here again we see specification of repeated violation of legislation that concern working time. So this includes also rest periods, weekly rest, mandatory leave, paid annual leave. Very important, and also we see this in the case law, is the element of health and safety. Here, the legislator does not even mention repeated violation, but refers simply to the violation of occupational health and safety regulation. And the last one concerns violation of the dignity of the worker, in particular through degrading working conditions, surveillance methods, or housing conditions where these are provided from the employer. Just a small clarification on the role of these indicators. They, in fact, do not define labor exploitation on their own. In fact, they are helpful for guiding court in identifying circumstances from which labor exploitation can be inferred, and as well clarify what the legislation understands by exploitative working conditions. So with regard to wages, hours, safety, and dignity at work. I think I will leave it to Franca now to give a few numbers on the phenomenon at global and Italian level.
So thank you. And we must refer to some kind of available numbers, even though all of us know that the numbers that we have are just the tip of the iceberg on this issue, as in many others. And with the conceptual challenges that we have just discussed, it is clear why universal, let's say, agreed upon definitions can get in the way of data collection, of significant data collection. So we have the global report of the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime in 2024. We see that it shows a 47% rise in persons in forced labor from 2019 to 2022. We have to ask ourselves, has this grown so much, or is our capacity to find the cases? I find that the questions that were asked before about invisibility are very relevant also here in this area, no? Is it the way that we are looking that has changed, or it is a phenomenon that has grown exponentially? I think there is a little bit of both. For the first time in the report, the proportion of persons being victimized for the purpose of labor exploitation has risen to 42%, which is higher than those for the purpose of sexual exploitation, that are 36% of the total. However, we see that criminal justice responses are much lower, and it is very hard to arrive to convictions. Only 17% of the convictions regard labor exploitation, while 72% of the convictions in trafficking regard sexual exploitation. We must remember that this report only considers formally identified cases that go through legal proceedings. That is different for the ILO report. The International Labour Organization report of the United uses very different meters and accesses much wider global databases to measure forced labor, and not all the cases can be identified with trafficking in persons. Forced labor is understood as all work or services extracted from any person under menace of any penalty and for which the said person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily, as Venera was saying. And ILO aims at offering global estimates, which is different than determined cases. So they are calculated very conservatively, and they include forced sex work within the forced labor, while the UN Office of Drugs and Crime separates cases of the two. And we have, maybe scholars here know Sheldon Zhang and their reminders since 2012 of the complexities of measuring labor trafficking. And as much as we have given significant strides since then, especially with shared concepts, but the issues are persistent. The ILO estimates a rise of 2.7 million persons in forced labor from 2016 to 2021. And there are 3.5 people in forced labor for each 1,000 people in the world. So it is really a very high proportion. Migrant workers have 3 times more risk of forced labor. There are almost 4 million in state-imposed forced labor and 3.3 million in forced labor that are children. These are the reports that we that we refer to as the global situation, but they signal also a very important gender difference. Of course, they do it in a binary way because they do not collect, as we said, information on transgender persons. The gender aspect, however, has to be mentioned because there is an important difference between labor exploitation and sexual exploitation. There is a decided prevalence of women in sexual exploitation, and it is reversed in labor exploitation to a decided prevalence of men. But the presence of non-prevalent genders, as that of children, in these measurements is likely underestimated and hidden. The sectors also are different. Men are prevalent in construction, for example, and women in domestic work, but there are exploited persons and severely exploited persons and forced labor cases in all sectors, in most economic sectors. We have, for example, been studying an editorial house that has published Harry Potter novels, etc. And they have been exploiting their workers. So even those who produce cultural products are exploiting workers. We know about the fashion sector, not only we know about not only agriculture, which is in Italy the first area in which the problem became visible, but we are seeing exploitation in labor in many sectors. The forms of threat used are also tended to be different, with a prevalence of forced confinement and confiscation of documents, deportation as prevalent within men, and wage non-payment, threat of dismissal, physical and sexual violence, and threats to family members as blackmail elements among women. In Italy, the legal proceedings, as you see, have spiked since the 2016 law that Venera has explained, peaking and later stalling during the pandemic years, but very few have originated in the workers' complaints. And now I leave you with Venera that will explain the policy angle.
Sorry, I like this. So there has been some discussion on the application of the 2016 law, and in fact, numbers appear to confirm expectations of critics of scholars that right after the adoption of the law did not see so much potential there, to the extent that they were pointing to the fact that we deserve much better than criminal law, and we deserve to have and elaborate other responses to effectively fight labor exploitation. In exploring the reasons that behind the limited number of criminal proceedings for labor exploitation from workers, there was some discussion on their limited role and why there are so few cases being reported, while we know that the phenomenon is much wider. In fact, rather than attributing this primarily to workers' reluctance to report and cooperate with authorities, there are some inherent limits to criminal law in providing an adequate response to labor exploitation. So while criminalization of the phenomenon has been the dominant national response, it is important in our view to be very careful about its limits. In particular, we want to highlight its underlying flaw, which is that criminal law treats labor exploitation as an exceptional labor market problem that is caused by a few, we could say, bad apples, employers and intermediaries that are particularly not integrated within the economic system, rather than the contrary. What gets missed in this picture is that we failed to see the structural mechanism that produce exploitation, and especially in particular, we provide few tools to protect workers that suffer labor exploitation. In fact, there is, unlike criminal law, there are other options. In particular, human rights law implies a shift of attention from the perpetrator to the workers and to workers' protection, and especially to the obligation of the state to protect victims as well as prevent labor exploitation. In addition to this, labor law is centered, in fact, on labor rights, and in particular on the concrete regulatory and institutional condition that make labor rights effective. This is clear, and I will give an example just to illustrate this through the 2014 ILO protocol to the Forced Labor Convention, that in fact brings together emphasis on educating and informing workers, ensuring that relevant legislation that protects workers applies to all workers, irrespective of their migrant status, provides measure for labor rights to be effectively enforced, to strengthen labor inspections and other enforcement services. In particular, when it comes to migrant worker, there is an attempt to decouple, to separate the possibility to enjoy labor rights and enforce your rights as a worker, irrespective of your status as a migrant. So I've been referring here to law as part of the response to labor exploitation. However, in our view, we need to, it is equally important to recognize the role of law itself as a driver of labor exploitation. And we have had the opportunity in our research to provide and see concrete examples of how law, in fact, plays as a driver of labor exploitation. This is true when we look at labor law in Italy and how recent reforms have shifted the balance between the employer's interest and workers' protection, making labor standards weaker. It is particularly clear when we look at migration law, at the way in which the states regulate migration and how this reflects and turns to limit the ability of the worker to negotiate working condition and to enforce, to claim the respect for their rights while when violations occur. And it's also true when we look at commercial law, on corporate law structures that support, that provide the infrastructure for a reorganization of the production processes, which intensify downward pressures on the value chain and especially on the weaker links in the supply chain and on workers. Some scholars have referred to this as a form of exploitation by design. In our own research, Franca was mentioning a case that we studied very much in depth, and we could see how, in fact, law provided the infrastructure for the employer intermediaries to exploit workers in a way that, at least on the surface, appear to be perfectly legal. So I think it's very important to point out that law can work both ways.
Just want to hop in here. Sorry, there's about 5 minutes left, and then we'll take some time for questions.
Okay, so I will be very, very brief from now on. We think that based on our research, we think that one important step forward in fighting labor exploitation moves and goes through a rethinking of the existing responsive. We think that it's important to focus on prevention. We need to act quick and before employment relations deteriorate in a way that can be qualified as severe labor exploitation. Coming after has a very high cost. We need to rethink responses based on the lived experiences of workers and learn from them on what makes them stay in labor exploitation and what makes them ask for help to get out of labor exploitation, as well as put together different agencies and adopt a multi-agency response. Just to provide a concrete example of how this can happen, if we can move to the next slide, Franca. We thought it was important to refer to this Fundamental Rights Agency report, which tells us directly from the experience of 237 workers, what does labor exploitation look from the perspective of someone that has experienced labor exploitation. So you can see here some of the examples that we previously mentioned: pay, working time, unsafe working places, degrading housing and living conditions where these are provided by the employer. Workers refer to physical and psychological violence, threats of dismissal and reporting. And here again, the connection with migration law is very, very strong. Sometimes retention of identity documents and restriction of contact with other people. From our own research, we have also identified as a common practice to keep workers in labor exploitation, also threat to family members in the country of origin. And there is so much we can learn from workers also on what are the risk factors. Migration status, it's there. When you are undocumented, you feel like you don't have alternatives. You are very much dependent on the employer, because under the existing system, you need the employer to make a declaration for you. The only way you have out of undocumented status is the availability of an employer that, when it's time, helps you to get your residence permit. Economic need, of course, especially with relation to the need to repay debts. And then some workers also mention information gaps. When asked what made them seek for assistance, need to recover wages. You see, this has nothing to do with criminal law or punishing the employer. Often, cooperation with authorities is driven by the expectation of regularizing migration status. And also in our own research, we realized from the experiences and interviews with workers that also very often the urge to seek assistance comes from escalation of retaliatory violence, especially after workers have claimed the respect of their rights. And I will leave it here to Franca to conclude.
We have selected some testimonials of our participants in the project Common Ground. And in this slide, we synthesize how residence permits in their voice help prevent exploitation. Our workers said, if you work regularly, you can ask, I don't like this. You feel like a person, not a working animal. You can ask, meaning you have the voice. Then it helps prevent escalation. And they say, you have to be patient until you have the documents. Oh, yes. But they do it too much. Maybe they do a little, they exploit you a little, that is okay. But they do more and more and more and always more. So if they had a document, they could prevent this escalation of exploitation and of their work. And an alternative job, they find you may always find bad employers, but if you're regular, you have documents, you can change jobs. If you're irregular, it is difficult to find a job. You need it and you must work. I wanted to speak about the multi-agency, but I don't think we have a lot of time. Anyway, as of responses, the national guidelines adopted in 2021 has envisioned an integrated system of referral and response to victims of labor exploitation. And our research in the project Common Ground was formed by 5 governments in northern Italy, regional governments, that wanted to benefit from the experience of the anti-trafficking programs and expand this knowledge of exploitation, linking the work of the anti-trafficking programs with labor inspectorates, with labor employment agencies, law enforcement, social and health services, and create a really multi-agency responses, an opportunity to of reciprocal training. I have a slide on the opportunities and challenges about this. And I have another slide on all the actions that we have taken in the project Common Ground. For example, regarding training, regarding joint outreach initiatives, regarding the identification of how does it work, how can we let how can we recognize when the situation is what the situation is and how to respond, and multiplying the people and the systems and the services that can do this identification. Then how can we facilitate for these persons the access and lowering the thresholds to the access to alternative labor, dignified labor, fair labor, and also how to respond to other needs that sometimes drive the exploitation, which are the absence of housing, other ailments like addiction or mental health issues. How can we put together a package that is custom made? Philemore speaks about service bricolage, no? How can we build the services around the persons at risk of exploitation or being exploited? And how can we prevent this? And then how can we drive societal change by connecting with migrant communities, by connecting with the consumers, and have public accountability in value change? There's a lot that we could also say. These are some numbers of the project, but we leave the slides to you. We would like to answer about what interests you more than
Thank you, Franca. And I do have your slides, so those will be sent out after for people to look through for that additional information that you had in there. I have a couple minutes for questions. I want to get to the one in the chat first, and then Irina, I see your hand raised. I'll get to you. But Shahid asked in the chat, so there are two types of labor exploitation in Italy. One is of legal workers, and the other is of illegal migrant workers. Are there any protections for exploitation of such illegal migrant workers in Italy?
Sure. Do you want to take this, Venera?
As you wish, yeah. In fact, labor exploitation is a phenomenon that concerns all workers. It's not just about migrant workers. I mentioned one case that, in fact, was concerned an Italian woman dying in the fields. But we know that it is specifically affecting migrant workers, and we think that this very much depends on the way that migration law builds a particular category of workers that is, let's say, very available, in fact, vulnerable to requests from the employer and has very limited negotiating power. The law takes into consideration this, and there is a specific provision which we think that has potential in supporting the way out of exploitation of migrant workers that have undocumented status, that allows exploited workers that cooperate with authorities. It's light. It's not required from them to report the case, that provide a helpful contribution to obtain a permit of stay that allows them to regularize their migration status. Though we think that this is not enough, and what we need is systematic channels that allow people to migrate legally in the first place, as well as systematic channels that allow people to ask for the regularization of their status, where they can show, for example, in this case, that they have an employment relationship. So all of them should be components.
I appreciate that.